Follow us today to a 1996 American romantic fantasy drama film called Phenomenon. Before we start, be aware, there are spoilers. As we begin the film, we see auto repairman George Malley being greeted by his friend Nate Pope. Nate gives George some solar panels to help improve George's home for his birthday. Later, at his repair shop, two of his employees, Tito and Baines, help George as he struggles to learn Spanish. Shortly after, Lace Penniman drives into the shop and George greets her. George helps Lace with some chairs she is selling and asks her to come with him to his birthday party. She declines, and they both end up seeing George's friend Doc and his birthday message to George. He asks her again to come, and she again turns him down. Later that night, the party is in full swing with Nate, Doc, and the rest of the town celebrating George. Doc gives George a chessboard, and the two begin a game. During the party, George goes outside and sees a strange light in the sky. The light intensifies, eventually knocking George unconscious. George wakes up, and the light is gone. He rushes back to the party and asks if anybody saw the same light, but no one has. George tries to explain what he saw to his friends while continuing his chess game with Doc. The friends think that he's not in his right mind, but he ends up winning against Doc, much to everyone's surprise. George goes home and tries to go to sleep. He suddenly has a revelation and calls Nate. Nate hangs up on him, and George goes outside to find a rabbit in his garden. The next day at his shop, a man named Roger comes by to get his vehicle, but is unable to pay. George figures out a roundabout way for Roger to get his vehicle, much to his employees' surprise. George continues to wow his employees by speaking fluent Spanish. He also, unknowingly, begins to display telekinetic abilities as he works on a vehicle. Later in the day, George sees Lace's children, Al and Glory, alone in a truck. Lace arrives and promptly gets ready to leave for San Francisco, poking fun at George for having seen an alleged UFO. At the local bar, George beats Doc yet again at chess. George tries to explain his newfound intelligence and consciousness. He goes to leave, and Doc asks him to come in for a checkup. George continues to absorb knowledge, watching as his solar panels are being installed, even creating different experiments and absorbing tons of new books and information. One night, George goes over to Nate's house, trying to sell him on some Lace's chairs. George also begins to tell Nate of his new discoveries and the knowledge, but Nate starts to feel uneasy. George hears some Morse code over Nate's radio and begins to decipher the message. Nate thinks it might be of military nature and warns against listening, but George continues, recording the message. That night, George is reading about some advanced mathematics. He finally realizes he has telekinetic abilities. George rushes outside yelling to the heavens, wondering what has happened to him. The next day, George is in Doc's office for his checkup. George reveals his newfound abilities to Doc's amazement. Doc then vows to find the reason for George's new powers and intellect. Back at his auto shop, George shows off a vehicle he has been making to Tito and Baines. Lace arrives delivering more chairs. George shows her some vegetables he has been growing in his garden. They have a bit of an awkward moment, and before George can give her some more tomatoes, she leaves. Later in the day, George is driving and sees Glory and Al. He offers them a ride home, and they accept. En route, George stops and shows the kids some different kinds of flowers, and Glory helps him make a small bouquet for Lace. Arriving at Lace's home, George gives her the tomatoes and the bouquet. They take a walk, and Lace expresses her reservations about any sort of relationship with George. He begins to feel something in the air and uses Lace's phone to call in a warning about an impending earthquake, but he's ignored. He has dinner with Lace and her family, complimenting her cooking. After dinner, George and Lace awkwardly say goodbye. As Lace and her children are putting away the dishes, the earthquake hits, proving George right. When George arrives home, Lace arrives and demands to know what's happening with him. She then sees all the chairs she has made in George's house, and she walks away, calling him a liar. The next day, George is with Nate, and he is showing Nate how he has solved the military code that they had been listening to. He has Nate send a message through the radio, and Nate tells him to give Lace a call. George then reveals his telekinetic powers to Nate, who is astounded. Elsewhere, Doc is responding to an emergency call. He is unable to understand the language his patient is speaking. He tells a woman to call George, giving her instructions for him to help with the translation. George is at his home with Nate. She was helping with George's garden. Nate is amazed at the fertilizer George has used. Shortly after, a man named Professor Ringgold arrives at George's house. He inquires how exactly George predicted the earthquake from the day before. Professor Ringgold asks George to come into his university for an interview, and he accepts. He then shows the professor some of his experiments he's been working on in his house. He asks to speak with some of the other professors at Berkeley, but he's interrupted. Tittle arrives to bring George to where Doc is, and on the way, Professor Ringgold watches as George learns Portuguese. Upon arrival, George talks to the patient to locate a missing boy named Alberto. Talking with a patient, he is able to find out the information needed as everyone stares in awe. They go searching for the young boy in the nearby orchard. George searches around and begins to feel pain in the stomach as he draws nearer to Alberto. Using his powers, he locates the boy in another area. George collapses, but not before using his telekinetic powers to uncover Alberto. Professor Ringgold is astounded and sets an appointment for George at the university, as well as with some of the other professors. George then meets Alberto's mother, Ella. She embraces George and expresses her thanks. Later that night, George tells Nate that he has hired Ella as Nate's housekeeper and cook. George then helps Nate learn a bit of Portuguese. At the bar, George is bothered by the townsfolk who are inquiring about the recent events that surround him. He begins to feel uncomfortable with all the questioning and leaves the bar. He goes to see Lace, apologizing for lying to her about the chairs she saw at his house. He invites her to go with him to the university, and she eventually agrees. Back at Nate's house, Ella arrives at his home for her new job. He then recites to her some of the Portuguese he learned from George. She smiles, then leaves. Elsewhere, as Georgia arrives home, he sees a bunch of FBI agents at his house. Agent Jack Hatch introduces himself, inquiring about the message George had made to send the military. George is then taken and forced to decipher other codes in front of multiple military personnel, including Agent Ted Rome. After the interrogation, Agent Ted wants George to be tested for his intellectual aptitude. He is then tested by a man named Dr. Bob. George confuses Dr. Bob, especially with his use of telekinetic powers. Meanwhile, at his mechanic shop, Lace is waiting for George. Agent Jack comes to visit George and tries to recruit him for intelligence work. George demands to go home, but Agent Jack tells him the government doesn't feel safe with George out of their control. At the university, Agent Ted meets with Professor Ringgold and tells the professor not to let George meet with any of the other professors. That night, George goes to Lace's house and tells her about the incident with the FBI. She admits that George scares her a little, and they both agree that George should probably stay away from her family. At the bar, George apologizes to Nate for what happened with the FBI. George then goes on a rant about his frustrations with his new abilities to his friends at the bar. He continues on, calling the light he saw a mistake. His anger continues to grow, and he accidentally breaks a window, scaring his friends. The next day, Tito tells George that Baines has quit the mechanic shop. Tito tries to console him, but is interrupted by Doc. Doc expresses concern over George, who is frustrated by the town's attitude towards him. Later on, George begins to manically work in his garden. He eventually stops, listening to the breeze amongst the trees. Over at her home, Lace's children bring her a piece of glass that George had broken earlier. Al tells his mother some of the rumors surrounding George, and she reprimands him for saying such things. Lace goes to visit George, who confesses things are becoming clear for him now. George states he doesn't want the townspeople to be afraid and that he will share some of his knowledge at a local fair. Lace then gives George a haircut and a shave, sharing an intimate moment together. Lace then leaves, but not before confirming that she will be willing to stick around George. Later on at the fair, George arrives with Nate and greets the townspeople who have come to hear him speak. George then begins to speak, answering questions and giving demonstrations on his abilities. There's even a news team on site as George continues to explain how his abilities work. However, people begin to get restless and start to demand answers from George. He is overwhelmed and collapses, and as he wakes up, he sees the same light in the sky, which renders him unconscious yet again. George wakes up in the hospital and is visited by Doc, Lace, and Nate. Doc reveals that George has a tumor in his brain that is somehow enhancing his mental capacity, but is also killing him at the same time. Doc then sits down and tells George that he is like a son to him. George also tells Nate to use his fertilizer formula in some of his fields in the coming spring. Both Nate and Doc leave, and George apologizes to Lace, who tells him that she loves him, and they embrace. Later, George is approached by Dr. Wellen, who asks permission to perform an open brain surgery on George. He also tells George that there is a very small chance that the tumor could be removed, and that George would survive for a little while longer. George refuses and claims that he has nothing to teach anyone by allowing them to study his brain. He claims himself the possibility for all humankind, an expedition of the human spirit. Later on, Doc confronts Dr. Wellen, who has lied to a judge about George's decision for open brain surgery. Doc reprimands Baines for his callous words against George. Baines continues on, and Doc becomes furious and condemns the townspeople for tearing down George. At the hospital, George takes some pills he has been stashing away and uses them to escape the hospital. Doc hears of the news from a policeman and lets the air out of his tires to buy George some time. George goes to Nate's house and gives him some writings to give to different people. They embrace and say goodbye, and George continues on his way. George arrives at home and greets Lace. The next morning, she sees that George is showing the kids how to fix her truck. The children are upset that George is dying as he goes to comfort them. Later in the day, Agent Jack arrives at Lace's home. She tells Agent Jack that she has not seen George, but he can see that George has definitely been with Lace. Surprisingly, Agent Jack lies to his partner and leaves Lace in peace. She then goes to see George, who is busy writing. They then become intimate, and later that night, George tells Lace that his time has come. He dies in her arms, and she embraces his body. The next day, she gives Professor Ringgold George's book of ideas, and he leaves. Lace breaks down into tears, but is calmed by the sound of wind amongst the trees. Her children come to see her, and she embraces them, and they listen together. A year passes by, and Nate is with Ella, gathering some of the crops that had been produced from George's fertilizer. They both arrive at George's honorary birthday party, where the whole town has gathered to celebrate George's life. Like and subscribe to watch more videos like this, and don't forget to turn on your notifications. That really helps my channel. Thanks for watching.